Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're taking a fascinating look back, really digging into how physics education has changed in the U.S. over, the last 160 years or so.
That's right. It's quite a span of time. And we're basing this mostly on a really interesting study published just this past July in New Physics, see Mulli. It's called A Study of Historical Changes and Paradigm Shifts in U.S. Physics Education from the 1860s to the present.
Right, so that's our main guide, and we'll pull in some other background context too.
Exactly. Some of the works it builds on.
And our goal today isn't just, a history lesson with dates. We want to really get at the big turning points, the fundamental shifts in how physics was taught, what people thought it was for, and importantly, what was driving those changes.
Yeah, and how those changes in the classroom kind of reflected what was happening in the wider world in society.
So to help structure this, the study uses something called Hull's paradigm change framework.
hmm It's a useful lens. Think of it as a way to see the sort of dominant set of beliefs and practices in physics education at any given time, and then pinpoint when and how those fundamentally shifted.
Okay.
And the study points to three really major paradigm shifts over this 160-year period.
Three big shifts. Okay, so it wasn't just slow, gradual evolution then. Sounds like there were some real ruptures.
Definitely seems that way. The study suggests these shifts often kicked in when the old ways of teaching just weren't cutting it anymore. Maybe they felt outdated or weren't meeting the needs of students or, society's needs.
And big national events played a part too.
Oh, absolutely. Big events often acted as catalysts, forcing a rethink of, how we should be teaching science, how we train engineers, that kind of thing. We'll definitely unpack those triggers.
Great. So let's dive into that first shift. The study calls it curricularizing physics, running roughly 1862 to 1902. What was the core issue here?
This was really the foundational period. It was about physics actually becoming a formal, established subject in American schools and colleges. Before this, it was kind of haphazard.
Oh, okay.
And alongside that, there was this growing idea that just reading about physics wasn't enough. You needed practical, hands-on experience. So a push for lab work started.
And you mentioned triggers. The Morrill Land Grant Acts, 1862, 1890. Those seem pretty key early on. How do they fit in?
Oh, massively important. Those acts basically gave federal land to states to set up colleges. And importantly, these colleges were focused on practical subjects, agriculture, engineering, the mechanic arts.
Right.
So this opened the door for science and technical education, including physics, for way more people. It wasn't just for the elite anymore. It was about building a skilled workforce.
And then MIT setting up its first physical lab in 1869, that feels like a concrete step towards that hands-on idea.
Exactly. It's a landmark. It shows a real investment in the idea that students needed to do physics, to experiment, not just listen to lectures. It's a move towards experiential learning.
But it sounds like there was also this need to define what should be taught. The study mentions the Harvard descriptive list from 1886. What was that about?
That was Harvard basically saying, okay, if you want to come here, here's the kind of physics preparation we expect. It listed specific experiments and topics. So it was an early attempt by a major player to standardize things a bit.
Setting a bar for college entry.
Yeah, hinting at the need for a more defined curriculum, at least for college-bound students.
So building on that Harvard list, you then had the Committee of 10 in 1892. They took a broader look, right?
They did, a really influential committee. Their big recommendation was that physics shouldn't just be for the college-bound. It should be part of the standard high school curriculum for everyone.
Wow, okay.
And they even suggested the core topics: mechanics, heat, sound, light, electricity, magnetism, basically outlining what high school physics should cover. That's a huge step towards embedding it in general education.
So really bringing physics into the mainstream for teenagers. And then another committee report in 1899, the Committee on College Entrance Requirements, that just solidified this further.
Pretty much, yeah. It reinforced physics as a key subject for getting into college and helped clarify expectations, creating a clear pathway from high school physics to university study.
It's interesting, though, the study mentions people like Herbert Spencer being influential, but also some pushback against lab work initially. Why were people hesitant about labs? Was it just cost?
Well, cost was definitely labs aren't cheap to set up and run. And it took time away from lectures and textbook work. But there was also maybe some philosophical resistance, like Spencer's ideas, which sometimes favored theory, and perhaps some skepticism about whether students messing around in a lab actually added much educational value compared to, say, a well-structured lecture demonstrating a principle.
So it took a while for the value of hands-on learning to really sink in.
It did. But despite that, high school physics just exploded during this time. The numbers are pretty stark.
Yeah, tell us about that growth.
The study points out it went from maybe 200 high schools offering physics to over 2,000 by around 1900. And student numbers jumped from maybe 20,000 to roughly 100,000 taking physics.
Huge increase.
Massive. It really shows physics becoming a standard part of the American high school experience.
And with all these new courses, you obviously needed teachers. That's where normal schools came in.
Exactly. Normal schools were teacher training colleges. They became crucial for preparing people to actually teach this newly widespread subject. You couldn't just expand the courses without training the instructors.
Okay, so that first shift sets the stage. Physics is established, labs are starting to gain ground. Now the second shift, physicist school-based physics education, 1903 to 1947. What's the vibe here?
This period sees physics teachers becoming more active, more organized. There's this new movement, as the study calls it, starting around 1906. Teachers themselves are saying, hey, we need to make this more practical, more relevant to students' actual lives.
Less abstract theory, more real-world connection.
Kind of, yeah. A feeling that physics shouldn't just be preparation for college physics, but should have broader value. This is also when you see things like the project method emerging, getting students to work on longer investigations.
And the beginnings of thinking systematically about how students learn physics. Early PER.
Very early stages, yes. People starting to ask what actually works in the classroom. Not yet a formal research field, but the seeds are there, asking questions about effective teaching.
But there were other forces at play too, right? Changes in the wider school curriculum.
Mm.
Educationists having more say.
Definitely. A big thing was the rise of general science around 1906. The idea was a broad overview of all sciences for everyone, which sounds good, but
It might have diluted the time and focus on specific subjects like physics.
that was the concern, yeah. A potential tension between giving everyone a little bit of everything versus allowing for deeper dives into subjects like physics.
And there was debate about the purpose of physics too. The study mentions a symposium in 1908-09.
Right. That symposium brought educators together to hash out these very questions. What is high school physics for? Is it just college prep? Or does it have wider goals like critical thinking, citizenship, and what are the best ways to teach it? These were active debates.
And those broader goals seem to connect to the cardinal principles of 1918.
Absolutely. The cardinal principles were about the overall goals of secondary education health, command of fundamental processes, worthy home membership, vocation, citizenship, worthy use of leisure time, ethical character. The thinking was, how can physics education contribute to these broader aims, not just scientific knowledge?
Interesting. This era also saw the birth of some key organizations, the APT and AIP.
Yeah, huge developments. The American Association of Physics Teachers, AAPT, in 1930, and the American Institute of Physics, AIP, in 1931. AAPT especially gave physics teachers a real professional home, a community.
A platform to share ideas.
Exactly. And launching their journal, the American Physics Teacher in 1933, later renamed, was vital for spreading teaching ideas, research best practices. It helped professionalize physics teaching.
Gave them a collective voice. And the AAP did a survey in 1941. What were they looking at?
That was an early attempt to gather actual data. You know, how many students are taking physics? What are the teachers' backgrounds? What resources do schools have? Getting a baseline understanding of the state of play across the country. Essential first step for any improvement efforts.
So this second period. Teachers organizing, pushing for relevance, debating purpose, even as the broader educational scene shifts. Okay, paradigm shift number 3. Reforming discipline-based physics education, 1948 to 1966. Sounds like a swing back towards the core subject.
It was, very much so. And the main driver, national concerns. Post-World War II, Cold War era, there was a strong feeling that the U.S. needed top-notch scientists and engineers for national security and technological leadership.
And the government steps in more directly, like with the National Science Foundation, NSF, in 1950.
Precisely. The NSF was created specifically to support basic research and science education. It poured federal money into science initiatives, including major efforts in physics education, a big shift in federal involvement.
But the real bombshell was Sputnik in 1957.
Oh, absolutely. Sputnik changed everything. The Soviets launching the first satellite sent shockwaves. Suddenly, it was a national crisis. Are we falling behind? Is our science education good enough?
And that led straight to the National Defense Education Act, the NDEA, in 1958.
Directly. The NDEA pumped huge amounts of federal money into STEM education, curriculum development, teacher training, lab equipment. Physics was a major focus. It was framed as a matter of national defense.
And this is when physicists themselves really got involved in curriculum design, right? Like the PSSC.
Yes, the Physical Science Study Committee, PSSC, starting in '56. This was a massive project led by prominent physicists. They designed a whole new high school physics course from the ground up.
What was their angle?
Deep conceptual understanding. They wanted students to really grasp the fundamental principles, the structure of physics, not just memorize formulas or do cookbook labs. It was rigorous, focused on physics as physicists understood
It
it.
was widely used for a time.
Very widely adopted, yeah. It had a huge influence, but its popularity did eventually fade somewhat.
Why was that? Too hard. Too abstract.
Probably a mix of things. Some found it, yeah, maybe too abstract or mathematically demanding for the average student.
Wow.
And maybe it didn't connect enough to everyday experience for some learners and teachers. The pendulum started to swing again, perhaps.
Which might explain the other big project from that era, Harvard Project Physics, 1962 to 72. How was that different?
Harvard Project Physics had a broader, more humanistic approach. Still rigorous physics, but they deliberately included historical context, how did these ideas develop, philosophical questions, connections to society and technology.
Trying to make it more engaging for a wider audience.
Exactly, showing physics as a human story, a creative endeavor, not just a set of laws dropped from the sky. So you had these two big, influential, but quite different reform efforts running somewhat in parallel. PSSC was more pure physics. Harvard Project Physics was physics in context.
So this third shift really saw physicists, driven by national needs, taking the reins of curriculum reform in a big way.
Definitely. A major intervention aimed at boosting the nation's scientific capability through education.
Okay, which brings us to the most recent period the study covers. Academic growth in physics education, roughly 1967 to 2020. Sounds like building on those reforms and the rise of PER as a proper field.
That's a good summary. This era sees physics education research, PER, really mature into a research-based discipline. Ideas from cognitive science, from broader education research, start seriously informing how we think about teaching and learning physics. It becomes much more systematic.
And tools like the Force Concept Inventory,
Yeah.
FCI, emerged in the 80s. Why was that so important?
The FCI was revolutionary, frankly. Before that, it was hard to know if students really understood the core concepts, like Newton's laws. They might be able to plug numbers into equations, but did they grasp the underlying physics? The FCI gave a reliable way to measure that conceptual understanding.
So you could actually see if a particular teaching method was working.
Exactly. It allowed researchers and teachers to compare different approaches, identify common student difficulties, those stubborn misconceptions everyone seems to have, and then design instruction to address them. It made PER much more evidence-based.
And then you get teaching strategies based on this research, like Eric Mazur's peer instruction in the mid-90s.
Right. Peer instruction is a perfect example of PER translating into classroom practice. Get students talking to each other about conceptual questions during the lecture. It leverages social learning, forces students to articulate their reasoning, way more effective than just passively listening.
And organizations and resources kept developing too. FISTech, FET simulations.
Yeah, PhysTech from 2001 focused specifically on improving how we train physics teachers, a critical piece of the puzzle. And PAT simulations, started around 2002, have been incredible. Free, interactive online sims that let students play with physics concepts. A powerful tool, especially as technology became more common.
Leveraging tech for learning. And PER got its own dedicated journal in 2005.
Physical Review Physics Education Research, yes. That was a major milestone. It signaled that PER was a serious, respected field of research within the broader physics community, a place to publish rigorous studies.
There was also America's Lab Report in 2006, pushing for inquiry-based labs.
Yeah.
What's the key idea there?
It was arguing that labs should be more than just following instructions to verify something already known. Inquiry-based labs get students involved in asking questions, designing procedures, analyzing their own data, figuring things out, developing real scientific thinking skills, not just technical skills.
More authentic science.
Exactly. And resources like Fisport popped up around 2011 to help teachers find and use all these PER-based methods and materials.
Right, making the research accessible. And we still see national reports and initiatives like PCAST in 2012, the STEM Education Act in 2015. So the national focus on STEM hasn't gone away.
No, it remains a priority. These reports and acts reflect the ongoing understanding that STEM fields, including physics, are vital for the economy, innovation, national security, all of it. So there's continued interest in improving outcomes.
And during this time, high school physics itself became more diverse. Conceptual physics, AP physics.
Yeah, that's a key trend, recognizing that not all students need or want the same kind of physics course. So you get conceptual physics, often with less math, focusing on the big ideas. You have regular physics, honors, and then AP physics courses designed to be equivalent to introductory college courses.
Catering to different needs and goals, and enrollment kept growing overall.
Yes, more students taking physics in high school than ever before across these different types of courses, which suggests a broader appreciation of its value.
And the curriculum broadened too, incorporating STS science, technology, society, and later STEAM.
Right. STS pushed for connecting science learning to real-world issues and societal impacts. And adding the A for arts and STEAM recognized the role of creativity, design, and interdisciplinary thinking in science and engineering. It's about seeing physics not just in isolation.
And finally, national standards like NSES and NGSS tried to provide some coherence across states.
Yeah, the National Science Education Standards in '96 and then the Next Generation Science Standards starting around 2013 aim to create common goals for what students should know and be able to do, emphasizing scientific practices alongside content knowledge. And underlying all this, continued efforts to better prepare and support physics teachers.
Because good teachers are key.
Absolutely essential. None of these reforms work without well-trained, supported teachers in the classroom.
Okay, wow. That's quite a journey through 160 years. Let's circle back to that paradigm change framework you mentioned at the start. How does looking through that lens help tie all these shifts together?
Hall's framework really highlights that these weren't just random tweaks. Each major shift happened because the existing system, the dominant paradigm, started to hit its limits. People recognized it wasn't working well enough. Maybe its authority was undermined by new ideas or pressing societal needs.
Like the need for labs, or the perceived irrelevance, or the Sputnik panic.
Exactly. Those created a kind of crisis, or at least dissatisfaction, that opened the door for a fundamental rethinking a new paradigm with different goals, methods, and assumptions to emerge.
And how did the roles of the different players, physicists, teachers, education specialists, change with each shift?
You can see a real evolution.
Yeah.
In the first shift, research physicists were maybe more defining the core content, with educators implementing it. In the second, physics teachers themselves became key agents of change, pushing for pedagogical innovation. The third shift saw research physicists jump back into curriculum design in a big way, driven by national priorities. And then this latest period, you see the professionalization of physics educational researchers, people who specialize specifically in understanding and improving physics learning, bridging physics expertise, and educational knowledge.
So what's the big takeaway from tracing this history? Why should we care about how physics was taught in, say, 1910 or 1960?
Because so many of the debates and challenges we face today have deep roots in this history. The tension between conceptual understanding and problem-solving skills, that's been around. How to engage all students, not just future physicists. Also a recurring theme, how best to use labs or technology. How to prepare teachers effectively. Understanding how these issues played out before gives us really valuable context.
It helps us avoid reinventing the wheel, maybe, or at least understand the landscape better.
Exactly. By seeing the patterns, the forces that drove past changes, we can be smarter about tackling today's challenges and thinking about where physics education needs to go next.
This has been incredibly insightful. So just to quickly recap for everyone, we've traced this evolution through three major paradigm shifts. First, establishing physics in the curriculum, curricularizing physics. Then, a push for relevance led by teachers in physicist school-based physics education, followed by the Cold War-driven reforms of reforming discipline-based physics education.
And then the subsequent era of academic growth, where PR really came into its own, building on those earlier efforts and bringing a more research-based approach to improving teaching and learning. Each shift driven by perceived limitations and often boosted by external events.
And the study suggests that understanding this whole long story can be useful even for other countries thinking about their own science education policies.
Yeah, it shows how history, culture, national priorities, they all deeply shape how subjects like physics are taught.
Okay, so here's a final thought for you, the listener, to chew on. We've seen how societal changes and national needs triggered massive shifts in physics education in the past. Thinking about today, the pace of technological change, especially things like AI, which the study we looked at actually mentions as a potential future factor.
Right, a big unknown.
What might the next big paradigm shift in physics education look like? What are the limitations of how we teach and learn physics now that might eventually lead to another fundamental change? It's definitely something to think about, this ongoing story of how we learn about the universe. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.